Hey everybody, and welcome back to Front-End Expert. In this video, we will be discussing the this keyword. So here in this example, all we have is a button, and it says click me. And then we have this empty JavaScript file. So let's start out by simply doing console.log of this. And if I run this code, you will see we log out the window object. So at the highest level, so the top level of our code, this simply means the global object, which in a browser is the window, but if you are using Node.js or something like that, it can be different depending on environments, but in a browser, this at the highest level is going to be the window. But then what happens if we create a function? So let's say function log this, and all I'm going to do in this function is simply console.log out this. And now let's call log this. Okay. So now when I run this code, you'll see we log out the window twice. But what's going to be interesting here is this will differ based on if we're in strict mode. So I'm going to add use strict to the top of our file to give us strict mode, and this is actually now going to log out undefined. This is one of those differences between strict mode and non-strict mode. When we use strict mode, this will be undefined by default when simply calling functions at the top level. However, in non-strict mode, in this same function call, the this keyword would be equal to the global object, which is the window. Okay, so next, let's take a look at an object. So I'm going to create an object, so let's say const obj, and we can set this equal to a object. And then inside of this object, I will add just log this. We could do log this, set this equal to log this, but we have the shorthand syntax to just include it once. And now instead of simply calling log this, what I want to do is I want to call object.log this and see what this logs out. And what this is actually going to log out is that object. So I will remove this first console log to make everything a little bit easier to see. And let's add one more value to this object. So let's do num, set it equal to 10. And now when we run this, you see we get the object with the number equal to 10, as well as we have the log this function inside of that object. Okay, this makes sense. When we're in an object, the this keyword is going to be the object itself, which is very useful. This means that if we are creating some function to be called inside of an object, we can use this and safely know that it is going to refer to that object. But next, what I want to look at is what happens with event listeners. So I'll come back up to the top of the file, and let's select that button we have. So we can do const button and set this equal to document.query selector of the button tag. So this is just going to get that button. And now I want to add an event listener to it. So let's say button.add event listener, and I want to add a click event. And when I click on the button, let's simply call log this. Okay. Let's save this and click on the button, and you'll see it logs out the button itself. So whenever we have an event listener and we use the this keyword inside of the callback function, it's going to refer to whatever the event was happening on. So in this case, the event listener was listening on the button, so it is going to log out the button itself. Now, there is a slight nuance here, and that is if we use an arrow function. So what I'm going to do is come back over to the log this function and change it to a declaration of const log this and set this equal to an arrow function. And now I'll also move the log this function to be at the top of our file, so it is declared before it is being used. And now when I save this and we click on the button, you'll see we actually log out the window. So what is happening here is that arrow functions do not get their own this binding. So when we use an arrow function, the this keyword is just going to refer to whatever it was in the environment above where that function was. So in this case, because the function is at the global scope, the this keyword is just referring to the window. Okay, but let's come back over here and change this back into a standard function. So I will go back to our function log this and add the parentheses at the end here, and we can save this again. Now what I will do is I'm going to remove the rest of this code as we are not using it anymore, And let's simply add log this as a function call back in, and you will see we once again log out undefined. But what if we had some object that we wanted to pass as the this parameter? So for example, what if I had const obj and I set this equal to some object and it has a num of 10, but I don't want to add log this as a property on this object. I just want to call log this with this bound to the object. So to do this, we have a few different options. The first one is we can call this function called bind. So this is a function of another function. So it's on the function prototype. So I can say log this.bind, and then bind takes in whatever we want to be bound to the this keyword. In this case, let's pass in the obj. Then bind returns a new function. So we can save the result of log this.bind. So I can say const bound log this and set this equal to log this.bind of obj. And now if we call bound log this as a function, because again, it returned a function, so bound log this is itself a function. When I save this, you will see that we still get undefined for log this, so that function is unchanged, but bound log this is now logging out obj as the this keyword because we passed in obj to bind. Now, let's say that log this also had some parameters, so it had x and y, and maybe we console.log x and y here. So all we're doing is passing in some parameters and logging them out. When we call bound log this, we could simply pass in x and y here. So for example, I could pass in 10 and 20. Now you can see we log out the object with the number of 10, as well as we log out 10 and 20. So these parameters are just being passed into the function like normal. And to make things a little bit more clear, I'll remove this other call to log this. And now we will have just the logs from our bound log this. But there's another way we can do this. And what we can do is we can add the parameters to the bind call. So for example, I could say bind 10, 20 here, and then remove the calls here. So now what this has done is it has created a new function that already has passed in 10 and 20. So these values will always be passed in to the first two parameters. And now when I run this, we get the exact same result. And it's worth noting that if I pass in parameters here as well, so for example, if here I pass in 30 and I save this, 30 isn't being used because it first is going to look at the parameters that were added to bind, and then it will use the parameters that came from the call to the result of the bind function. So for example, if I just had 10 here, then we end up getting 10 and 30 because it uses this parameter first, so that one became x, and then it uses this parameter, so this one became y. Now, sometimes you don't want to return a new function, you just want to call the function immediately. You only need it one time. And the way we can do that is through another function of the function prototype. So we can say log this dot call, and this works the same way as bind, the only difference being that it doesn't return a new function, it just immediately calls it. So we can say call of obj, and let's pass in 10 and 20 again. And then let's remove the bound log this for now, and we can get rid of this call. And you'll see that we get the result of logging out 10 and 20, as well as that object that we passed in here. And we can also pass in anything here to both bind and call, so it doesn't need to be an object. For example, if I passed in the number 123, then 123 is now bound to this. That said, this is a bit of an anti-pattern, and the behavior can be a bit strange in some cases since we usually expect this to be an object. For example, in non-strict mode, this number, and any primitive for that matter, would be converted into a wrapper object. And similarly, null and undefined would be converted back into the global window object. So anyways, let's switch back to obj, and then the takeaway is simply that this argument should almost always be an object. And finally, there is one more function like this, and that is going to be apply. So apply works the exact same way as call. The only difference is that rather than passing in the parameters individually, we will pass them in as an array. So apply with an array of these values is the exact same thing. as call with the values individually as parameters. Okay, next, let's remove all of this code. And what I want to look at now is how we can use this within the array iteration functions. So let's create an array. We can call it 1, 2, 3. So we'll have the values 1, 2, and 3. So what I want to do is on this array call for each. And inside of for each, I will pass an anonymous function. Let's take the number, and for now, simply console.log out the number. Now we can add these semicolons, run this code, and as you would expect, we log out 1, 2, and 3. But now, what would happen if inside of this function, we console.log this? Well, we log this, and because we created a function, so we have this anonymous function inside of the for each loop, this is going to be equal to the window. And of course, if we added use strict here, then now it's going to log out undefined. Additionally, if we add an arrow function here, then the arrow function is not going to get any new this binding, so the arrow function is going to end up logging out the window because of the fact that this context above the arrow function is the global context, which is the window in the browser. But let's go back to our anonymous function. And what I want to show now is we have another parameter that we can pass to the for each loop, and we can pass this parameter to most of the iteration functions on the array. And that is going to be what they call the this argument, and it goes after the callback function. So for example, I could pass an object after this callback function and give it a number of 10. And now when I run this code again, you will see that the object with num set to 10 has been bound to the this keyword. So when we log out this in each iteration, we log out the object that we passed in. However, if we change this back to an arrow function, it will still act just like an arrow function, and we will log out the window because of the fact that the arrow function does not have its own this context, and thus it just ends up with the global this, which is the window. Okay, now let's remove this array and the for each call. And what I want to do now is I want to look at a class. So let's create a class. We can call it class person. And inside of this class person, we will have a constructor. And maybe this constructor takes in a name and sets this.name equal to the name. And then we can have a method on the class. So let's call the speak method. And we will have this method maybe console.log hello, I am plus this.name. What this is going to do is it creates a person class, and we have the constructor, which uses the this keyword, as well as we have the speak function, or the method on the person class, and it is also using the this keyword. So let's create a person and see how this is going to work. So I can say const, and I will make this person myself. So we can say const Connor equals new person, and for the name, I will pass Connor. So now let's save this code. And what I want to do first is in the constructor, let's console.log this. And when I save this, you can see we get the person, but it's just an empty object. So what happens when we call the constructor function is the this keyword is bound to the new object that is being created. So I can get rid of this, and you can see that we have this.name setting the name. So if I console.log this after the this.name being set to name, you can see now we have the person with the name of Connor. Okay, now let's remove this console log as well, and let's look at the speak function. So I'm going to call Connor.speak, and what this is going to log out is hello, I am Connor. And the way this works is that in any method on a class, so for example, the speak method, the this keyword is going to refer to that current object. So if I added one more person, so let's say const Clement and set Clement equal to a new person and say Clement, then if we call Clement.speak, we are going to end up seeing hello, I am Clement. So the this keyword is referring to the object that is this instance of a person, so this specific object. Okay, so that's going to do it on this video on the this keyword. The key point to remember here is that this is usually going to be a runtime binding, which means that it is based on the context with which we call the this keyword. So in a function, this isn't always going to be the same thing based on where we called that function. And most of the time, JavaScript is pretty reasonable about this. It usually results in the keyword of this equaling whatever we would expect it to equal in that context. But you do want to be aware of some of the little intricacies here and there of things like how useStrict can change the functionality of this in functions, as well as the difference between an arrow function and a standard function. So that's going to be the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something new, and I'll see you in the next one.